Debt was never the enemy. Ignorant debt was the enemy. That is the first truth I want you to hear, and I want you to hear it without the fog of slogans people repeat, because those slogans sound responsible. I have lived long enough to see what debt does to the foolish, and I have lived long enough to see what debt can do for the disciplined. Those are not the same story. Most people were taught one childish lesson: owe nobody anything, pay cash for everything, avoid loans, stay safe. It sounds clean, it sounds moral, it sounds like the sort of thing a tired father says at the kitchen table because he wants to protect his children from pain. I understand that instinct, but the world does not reward clean slogans nearly as much as it rewards correct structure. There are really three kinds of people when it comes to debt. The first kind borrows because they want something they cannot yet afford: a nicer car, a better vacation, more furniture, better clothes, a faster upgrade of the visible life. These people use credit to consume, and the bank feeds on them. Their payments come from wages. The thing they bought usually declines in value. Their freedom shrinks. Their margin disappears. They call that normal adulthood. It is not normal adulthood. It is dependence in monthly form. The second kind avoids debt almost entirely. They think they are wiser. In some ways they are. They save, they wait, they buy only when cash is available. They do not hand the bank interest payments for lifestyle inflation. That is already much better than the first group. But they often miss something large. In avoiding debt entirely, they also avoid leverage entirely. They remain safer than the first group, but they usually build wealth slower than they could have because they never learned the difference between productive debt and consumptive debt. Then there is the third kind. The third kind understands something the system never explains clearly to the public because the public, left financially confused, is easier to monetize. The third kind understands that debt is neither noble nor evil. It is arithmetic. It is a tool in the hands of a fool. It behaves like fire in a dry room. In the hands of a disciplined owner, it behaves like fuel. That is the group I want you to understand. Not because I want you to become flashy, not because I want you to worship leverage like an adolescent who just discovered the word exponential and now thinks risk is for other people. I want you to understand it because the modern world quietly punishes people who never learn how capital actually works. The middle class thinks in payments. Owners think in spread. Owners ask, what does this asset earn relative to the cost of capital? That one question separates lives. I knew a man years ago who bought a large sport utility vehicle with a loan because he had reached an age where he thought life should finally reflect his effort. He was not irresponsible in the theatrical sense. He worked hard, he loved his family, he paid his taxes. He simply made the same mistake millions make every year. He confused visible improvement with financial progress. The truck cost him every month. Insurance cost him. Maintenance cost him. Fuel cost him. Depreciation cost him. The loan payment came from his salary. Nothing about the structure paid him back. At almost the same time, another man used a similar amount of money to control a small duplex. His obligation was real. His risk was real. But the cash flow moved differently. Rent came in. The asset gradually carried more of its own weight. Debt reduced over time. Equity rose over time. What felt like a burden slowly became a machine. Same city, same era, same banking system, totally different. One man financed ego, the other financed acquisition. That is the line. It is thinner than people think, and it is crossed every day by people who tell themselves very flattering stories. You must learn to ask what the debt is buying, not what it looks like, not how it will feel for 6 weeks, not whether the neighbors will think you are finally doing well. What is the debt buying? If the answer is a liability, a rapidly depreciating object, a short emotional reward, a lifestyle symbol, then the debt is almost certainly making you smaller. If the answer is control over an asset that produces income, appreciates sensibly, creates equity, or expands your financial footprint, then the debt may be making you larger. That is the first principle. Borrow for acquisition, never for ego. I do not say that because it sounds stern. I say it because life becomes brutally different depending on which side of that sentence you spend your years. The second principle is that leverage is power, but over-leverage is collapse. This is where the children are separated from the adults. People hear that the wealthy use debt and they become intoxicated too quickly. They think the secret is simply to borrow. It is not borrowing without structure, is not sophistication. It is gambling with better vocabulary. Leverage magnifies everything. It magnifies sound judgment. It magnifies poor judgment. It magnifies good cash flow. It magnifies weak cash flow. It magnifies patience. It magnifies stupidity. That is why a smart person can use leverage to accelerate wealth, and a foolish person can use the same instrument to accelerate ruin. I have never admired boldness on its own. Boldness is often just insecurity moving faster. What I admire is controlled boldness, margin, cushion, room. Those are the things that make leverage survivable. Most people misunderstand what destroys them. They think the asset failed. Often the structure failed. They think the deal was bad. Often the margin was too thin. They think the market turned against them unfairly. Often they had no room for the ordinary unpleasantness every real asset eventually brings. Suppose you buy 3 rental properties that each only barely cover themselves in a good month. That may look efficient on paper to somebody intoxicated by scale. Then one tenant stops, then a repair arrives, then refinancing terms worsen, then one property begins consuming your paycheck. Then the second one becomes delicate. Suddenly the problem is not real estate. The problem is that you confused maxing out with winning. The bank approves based on its models. You should borrow based on your sleep. That is a sentence I wish more people understood. Just because a lender says yes does not mean yes is wise. Lenders protect themselves first. They do not structure your life for your peace of mind. They structure the loan for their probabilities. If the bank says you qualify for $500,000, maybe $350 is the grown-up answer. If the bank says you can carry 5 properties, maybe 3 strong ones are the wiser beginning. More is not always better. Often better is better. The world loves scale because scale is visible. Quiet durability is harder to admire on social media. Too bad. Quiet durability survives. The real goal is not to borrow as much as possible. The goal is to borrow on terms and at a size that still leave you strong if things become inconvenient, because things always become inconvenient. A vacancy, a repair, a policy shift, a rate adjustment, a slower season in your business, a customer who pays late. Pressure always reveals whether the debt structure was intelligent or merely enthusiastic. That is why I love reserves. Reserves are not lazy money. Reserves are emotional stabilizers in dollar form. They prevent small storms from becoming forced sales. They prevent an ugly quarter from becoming a humiliating conversation. They let you make calm decisions while others begin liquidating good assets because their structure left no room for bad luck. Every leveraged asset must have a cushion, not because I am timid, because life does not respect neat spreadsheets. You need liquidity, you need room, you need fixed obligations small enough relative to your cash flow that you can survive being wrong for a while without being expelled from your own strategy. The third principle is spread. Here the conversation becomes very boring and therefore very important. If you do not understand spread, you are not leveraging, you are guessing. Spread is simply the difference between what the money costs you and what the asset earns you. If you borrow at 6% and the asset earns 12% with enough stability to trust the math, you have a positive spread. That spread is the beginning of wealth creation through borrowed. If you borrow at 7% and the asset returns nothing, or returns only through a fantasy of future appreciation, then you are not building, you are subsidizing a story. The wealthy do not fall in love with the object, they fall in love with the numbers. That may sound cold. Good. Numbers should be cold before you sign warm contracts. If you buy a property because the neighborhood feels exciting, because your cousin says everyone is moving there, because the finishes look premium, because the kitchen photographs well, but the actual cash flow does not cover the debt properly after maintenance, taxes, insurance, vacancy allowance, and real-world ugliness, then you did not buy an investment. You bought a hope machine. Hope machines are very popular. They are also expensive. The right question is not, could this asset appreciate? The right question is, what does it do for me under conservative assumptions? What if rent is lower than the optimistic estimate? What if the business expands slower? What if expenses rise? What if rates are higher when I refinance? What if the world is less cooperative than my sales pitch? That is how professionals think. The amateurs calculate only the good month. The adults calculate the bad quarter. If the structure works through friction, then the leverage deserves respect. If it works only when every variable behaves, then it deserves suspicion. There are two kinds of yield people confuse constantly: cash yield and total return. Cash yield is what lands in your hand. Total return includes appreciation. Appreciation is pleasant. Cash flow is protective. In a difficult year, appreciation on paper can disappear. Cash that arrives from a durable asset can still pay the note, refill the reserve, or fund the next move. That is why I always prefer leverage tied to cash flow over leverage tied only to hope for appreciation. Appreciation can make you rich. Cash flow keeps you alive long enough to find out whether appreciation ever arrives. And once you understand spread, you stop asking how much debt do I have and start asking what is my net productive spread after real friction. A man can carry millions in debt and still be structurally powerful. If the cash flows are strong, the terms are favorable, the assets are good, and the spread is healthy, another man can have no debt and yet be stagnant because he owns nothing that grows, produces, or compounds. Debt alone means nothing. Spread means everything. The fourth principle is inflation. This is where a great many people misunderstand the whole game because they think inflation hurts everyone equally. It does not. Inflation punishes savers who sit still. Inflation punishes wage earners whose expenses rise while nothing productive is working for them. But inflation can quietly reward the borrower who locked in cheap fixed debt against appreciating or income-producing assets. That is one of the strangest truths in modern finance, and one of the least emotionally comfortable. People want to believe owing money is always bad. Yet the person with a long fixed mortgage on a productive property, while inflation pushes rents, replacement costs, and nominal asset values upward, is often in a much better position than the person clutching cash while everything he wants to buy becomes more expensive. Why? Because the nominal debt stays what it is, the dollars used to repay it become weaker over time, while the asset and the income stream tied to it can strengthen. That is not cheating. That is policy arithmetic meeting correct structure. If your payment is fixed and your asset has pricing power or scarcity value, inflation can become your silent partner. If your debt floats upward with rates, if your asset has no pricing power, if your cash flow is weak, then inflation can expose your fragility very fast. Again, it comes back to structure. A fixed-rate loan on a solid asset in an inflationary world can be a quiet gift. A variable-rate loan on something flimsy can be a slow execution. So do not merely ask whether inflation is high. Ask which side of it you live on. Are you the person whose cash shrinks while you complain, or the person whose fixed debt gets lighter in real terms, while asset income and asset value have a chance to climb. That difference is not luck alone. It is positioning. The fifth principle is credit positioning. People talk about banks as though the bank is a judge handing down verdicts on worthiness. That is not how sophisticated borrowing works. Banks are risk merchants. They lend on probabilities. If you look disorganized, stretched, desperate, inconsistent, or reckless, you will either pay more or be denied. If you look calm, liquid, timely, documented, and disciplined, then your cost of capital can improve dramatically. That matters because small differences in cost become large differences in spread. Credit is not a moral score. It is leverage capacity, a strong credit file, low utilization, timely payments, controlled debt to income, documented income, and liquid reserves all say the same thing to a lender. This person is not begging. This person is structurable. That changes the power dynamic. The ordinary borrower walks into a bank hoping to be approved. The serious borrower prepares so thoroughly that the bank begins competing for the relationship. That is when the conversation improves. Better terms, longer durations, fixed options, cleaner covenants, more room. That is what maturity looks like in money, not emotional hostility toward the bank, not fear. Preparation. The bank should not be your father, your priest, or your enemy. It should be a fuel station. Fuel is not moral, it is neutral. The vehicle and the driver determine the destination. That is why I always tell people to treat credit history as financial reputation. Credit takes time to build and minutes to damage. A single late payment can raise your cost of capital. A higher cost shrinks your spread. A smaller spread weakens the whole machine. Everything is connected. The sixth principle is deployment. Access to capital means nothing if you do not know where to place it. This is where many people fail after all the right preparation. They sharpen the weapon and then point it at nonsense. Debt should be deployed into compounding machines, not static symbols, not dead assets, not ego purchases dressed up as deserved rewards. A compounding machine is something that produces, then lets that production be reinvested, which creates more production, which funds the next layer, and so on. Cash-flowing real estate can do this. Scalable digital products can do this. Quality dividend equities can do this when understood correctly. The mechanism matters more than the category. A man who buys one property that throws off real surplus and then uses that surplus as seed capital for the next acquisition is doing something very different from the man who buys one property, feels richer immediately, and upgrades his life with every excess dollar. That is the great psychological divide. Amateurs consume profits, professionals reinvest profits. The first one feels like success. The second one becomes success. Compounding rarely flatters you early. It asks you to look average while the machine beneath the surface gains strength. That is why so few people stay with it. If your leveraged asset produces $1,000 a month and you immediately enlarge your lifestyle by $1,000 a month, then the leverage has not accelerated your future. It has merely decorated your present. That is the trap. The trap is not debt. The trap is emotional leakage. I once met a man who owned a small printing business. Nothing glamorous, not the sort of business young people brag about at parties. He used a modest loan to buy a newer machine that cut labor hours, reduced waste, and let him accept higher value work he previously had to turn away. The machine did not make him look richer. It made him richer. The cash flow from that upgrade funded the next operational improvement. Then another 10 years later, his competitors were still talking about market conditions. He owned the building, the equipment, and most of his own schedule. That is what intelligent debt looks like. It buys capacity. It buys time compression. It buys control over an economic engine. A car bought for appearance does the opposite. It expands cost and narrows time. It asks for your labor. It does not release it. The seventh principle is psychology. Before debt breaks a balance sheet, it often breaks the mind. The math can be sound. The spread can be positive. The structure can be intelligent. But if your mind is weak, you can still ruin the whole arrangement. Leverage amplifies who you are. If you are disciplined, it magnifies discipline. If you are greedy, it magnifies greed. If you are fearful, it magnifies fear. If you are impulsive, it gives your impulsiveness bigger consequences. That is why I do not want debt to feel thrilling to you. I want it to feel neutral, not heroic, not shameful, not proof of power, not proof of sin, arithmetic. That is the right emotional relationship. If your debt controls your mood, you have already borrowed too much or structured too weakly. If you check rates every day with anxiety, if 1/4 of softness destroys your sleep, if you need constant external reassurance that your leverage is still acceptable, then the structure is not serving you. The wealthy are emotionally boring with money. That is one of the least sexy and most profitable truths I know. They calculate, they prepare, they keep buffers, they do not celebrate loans, they do not perform sophistication, they manage exposure. And perhaps most importantly, they resist the temptation to upgrade life too early when leverage begins working. That is where most investors and owners quietly self-destruct. One successful property, one scaling business, one strong, and the ego begins whispering that permanent wealth has arrived. It has not. Early profit is not finished wealth. Early profit is fuel for the next stage. There is a peculiar danger in success that arrives before maturity. The immature person interprets the first strong result as proof that the structure can now support his vanity. The mature person interprets the same result as proof that the structure deserves reinforcement. That difference compounds. The immature borrower buys watches. The mature borrower buys time. The immature borrower increases visible consumption. The mature borrower increases reserves, lowers fragility, and funds the next productive move. The eighth principle is evolution. Leverage is a phase, not a religion. This is where nuance matters most. In the early stage, debt can help you compress time and control assets you could not otherwise reach. In the middle stage, the question becomes optimization. Is the debt still ideal? Can the rate be improved? Can the duration be extended? Can the structure be refined? In the later stage, something beautiful can happen. Debt becomes optional. That is real freedom. Not because all debt vanishes automatically, because you are no longer depending on it for survival or expansion. You can hold it if it remains mathematically favorable. You can eliminate it if peace is now worth more than incremental spread. You can refinance, reposition, or reduce with calm. That optionality is what the first stage was meant to buy you. People get childish here too. Some become frightened and eliminate productive low-cost debt too early, sacrificing compounding because being debt-free sounds emotionally pure. Others become proud and hold debt forever because they think eliminating it would signal weakness. Both extremes are stupid. Again, adulthood lives in nuance. If you have fixed debt at 3 or 4% against a strong cash-flowing asset in an inflationary world, why rush to extinguish that gift? If the debt costs 9% and the asset yields 6%, why pretend this is strategic? Debt should be killed when the spread disappears, when the risk profile worsens beyond the reward, or when your stage of life makes peace more valuable than additional expansion. Debt should be held when it remains cheap, productive, and subordinate to a strong structure. This is how adults think. not emotionally, strategically. The ninth principle is diversification from strength. Leverage builds quickly. Concentration kills quietly. This happens all the time. A man finds one model that works. Residential rentals in one city, one service business with one dominant client, one product type, one asset class. It performs well, confidence rises. He doubles down. Then triples. Soon his whole life is tied to one local market, one financing environment, one kind of customer, one kind of political risk, one kind of regulation, one kind of economic cycle. That is not mastery. That is exposure wearing confidence. Diversification does not mean owning random things you barely understand. That is chaos. It means expanding from competence into adjacent assets, adjacent funding sources, adjacent income streams, and staggered maturities, so that one shock does not echo through every wall of the structure at once. The first phase should be concentrated competence. The second phase should be controlled expansion. Not random complementary. That might mean rental property cash flow plus a scalable business, or business profits plus dividend equities, or multiple lender relationships so that one bank's caution does not become your prison. Flexibility is power. People underestimate that because flexibility does not always photograph well. The 10th principle is timing your structure, not timing the market. This is one of the great obsessions of mediocre investors. Is this the perfect time to buy? Are rates ideal? Is the market overheated? Should I wait until headlines improve? The world is full of people who have delayed sensible action for years while waiting for the environment to feel beautifully obvious. By the time obvious arrives, the opportunity often leaves. You cannot perfectly time markets. You can prepare yourself perfectly to act when the math is favorable enough. That is a much better game. A strong structure works across multiple conditions. The spread works now. The cash flow works now. The reserve exists now. The leverage is survivable now. That is all I require. I do not need perfection. I need durability. The person waiting for perfect conditions often does nothing, and nothing over long enough periods is one of the costliest strategies ever invented. The world changes, inflation eats, opportunity passes. Your life continues aging while you remain theoretically prudent and practically stagnant. I dislike stagnation. The 11th principle is systems beyond income. A lot of people think the goal is merely to replace their paycheck. That is still employee thinking in nicer clothing. The real goal is to build systems that generate cash flow with less and less direct dependence on your daily labor. One rental property is income. A property system is something else. A solo service business is income. A business with processes, managers, repeat customers, and capacity to operate without your constant presence is something else. A digital product that sells without your hourly involvement is something else. The question becomes this: does this use of debt merely increase my income, or does it increase my system capacity? System capacity is how wealth becomes scalable. That is what eventually separates a person who has to keep producing from a person who allocates, refines, and decides. When your systems are working, your life changes in ways the purely salaried person has difficulty imagining. You are no longer selling every hour. Your income is not tied to one stream, one boss, one set of negotiations with fate. That is the true meaning of leverage when used correctly. It is not a shortcut to looking rich. It is a path towards structural independence. The 12th principle is sovereignty. There is a stage beyond leverage where the question is no longer how do I get approved or how do I expand. The question becomes, what do I still need permission for? That is a beautiful question. Financial independence means your income covers your lifestyle. Financial sovereignty means your structure protects your freedom, even when conditions change. Those are not the same. A person can be independent and still fragile. One shock, one legal issue, one macro shift, one key income stream interrupted, and the whole structure begins shaking. Sovereignty is quieter, strong cash flow, conservative debt relative to equity, healthy reserves, diversified income streams, controlled expenses, no addiction to endless lifestyle growth. At that point, you are no longer chasing opportunities in desperation. You are selecting them. You no longer fear downturns the same way because your structure was not built on perfection. You no longer need leverage. You use it only when it remains strategically optimal. That is power. The 13th principle is identity. This is deeper than most people want to go because it forces them to admit that their money problems are not all numerical. Many are philosophical. If deep down you believe money is scarce, dangerous, shameful, or too complicated for you, your behavior will reflect that long before a balance sheet does. If you believe wealthy people are only lucky, crooked, or somehow outside your category of human, then you will sabotage yourself the moment progress begins, because your identity will reject the result. I have seen people earn more and remain broke because the income changed, and the identity did not. Spending rises, anxiety stays. Wealth does not stabilize. That is why I say you must stop thinking like a consumer and start thinking like an allocator. Consumers ask, what can I afford monthly? Allocators ask, what does this dollar do to my future structure? Consumers use debt to acquire status. Allocators use debt to acquire control. Consumers increase lifestyle at the first sign of surplus. Allocators increase reserves, assets, and system capacity first. Identity drives tolerance. Tolerance drives action. Action drives outcome. That is not motivational nonsense. That is simply how repeated human behavior works. The 14th principle is integration. Leverage without identity becomes arrogance. Identity without structure becomes fantasy. Structure without reserves becomes fragility. Reserves without deployment become timidity. Deployment without discipline becomes chaos. Everything connects. That is the real lesson. You do not become financially strong by memorizing a few sayings about debt or quoting famous men on leverage. You become financially strong by integrating the principles into one operating system. Audit your life honestly. Rank your liabilities by cost and purpose. Eliminate what is predatory. Protect what is useful. Build reserves before vanity. Borrow for acquisition, never for ego. Understand spread before you sign. Prefer fixed terms where inflation favors them. Stress test the structure. Maintain a reputation lenders respect. Deploy into compounding machines. Keep your emotions neutral. Let leverage evolve instead of worshiping it. Diversify from competence. Time your preparation, not your fantasies. Build systems, not just income. Aim for sovereignty, not spectacle. That is the whole thing. People want this subject to be more mysterious than it is. It is not mysterious. It is demanding of discipline, demanding of honesty, demanding of patience, demanding of the willingness to look ordinary while you build something powerful underneath the visible life. Most people will not do that. They will use debt to finance consumption and then call the system unfair. Or they will avoid debt entirely and then wonder why people with no greater talent somehow built more control over time. The answer in both cases is structure. The bank did not beat them. They never learned how to use the bank correctly. And once you understand that, the whole world changes. You stop fearing loans in the childish way. You stop worshiping cash in the naive way. You stop confusing being debt-free with being wealthy. You stop admiring appearance and start admiring spread, margin, reserves, and systems. You stop asking whether debt is good or bad. You ask whether this debt makes me larger or smaller. That is the adult question. That is the question that separates people who stay average from people who become quietly formidable. And if you live by that question long enough, the bank stops being the master of your future. It becomes one of the tools you used, carefully and unsentimentally, to build it.